hours crossed into the small town of Mosby, Nebraska, a place that didn't even show up on most maps. He had been driving for over 20 hours straight, heading back to New York for Christmas. The radio was playing "Santa Claus is Coming to Town," but all Brian could think about was sleep. He was too cheap to fly, figuring it would be a good chance to take in the open road. What he didn't anticipate was just how desolate the landscape would become, as if he had entered a world cut off from the rest of civilization. The highway stretched on endlessly. Just him and his car, save for the occasional stray bird that swooped across the horizon. It was cold, and he'd passed several signs warning about icy roads. The dashboard clock read 3:10, and Brian was beyond tired. His eyelids felt like cement, but he needed gas and food. Spotting a sign off to the side of the road boasting about the world's largest vacuum cleaner at a nearby gas station, he figured it was as good a place as any to stop. The vacuum was some local attraction, a Strang. As he pulled into the station, he caught a glimpse of the vacuum through the frosted windows. It was a cheap fiberglass monstrosity standing no taller than 6 feet, lit up by Christmas lights like some weird roadside shrine. The gas station itself was an old shack, with nothing but a faded sign offering greasy food and overpriced fuel. The icy wind whipped across his face as he filled the tank, cursing under his breath when he saw the prices. He paid at the pump, tossed the receipt into the snow, and made his way across the street to the diner. The door jingled as he entered, and the smell of burnt coffee mixed with stale grease hit him immediately. It was nearly empty, save for a few other lonely souls scattered around, sipping on their drinks. He noticed a cop car parked out front, its lights turned off, and the officer inside appeared to be half asleep, snacking on a chocolate bar. Brian shook his head as he stepped inside and made his way to a booth. A man in his late 40s greeted him from behind the counter, his apron stained and the green paper chef's hat sitting crooked on his head. His eyes were dull and lifeless, but his voice was sharp.
"What can I get you?"
he asked with a forced cheer. Brian didn't waste any time.
"Double cheeseburger, fries, and the biggest soda you got,"
he said as he scanned the menu in front of him. The hunger in his stomach was gnawing at him.
"You got it!"
The chef grunted, turning around without another word. Brian looked around the small diner. The other patrons seemed to be ignoring him, too busy with their food to notice the new arrival. One of them, a man dressed in an army surplus jacket, was sitting by himself, his face hidden behind his hair. His eyes were strangely hollow, as though he had been staring at something too long, or perhaps at nothing at all. Brian took a sip from the massive glass of soda the chef had just set in front of him. It was ice cold and fizzy, and he gulped it down quickly, trying to wake himself up. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was until now, the bubbles almost feeling like they were shaking off the exhaustion. He was so caught up in the refreshment that he didn't notice the figure looming behind him.
"Want to see the Christ child?"
The voice rasped. Brian spun around, startled, nearly knocking over his drink. The man in the army jacket stood there, his eyes locked onto Brian's, unblinking.
"Who?"
Brian managed, still in shock.
"The Christ child. You want to see him?"
The man repeated, his lips curling into a smile that revealed yellowed teeth. Brian stared at him for a moment,
You're not making sense. Christmas isn't for a few days. You're a few days early, buddy.
He let out a nervous laugh. The man's smile didn't fade.
No scam. I'll show you the Christ child, and if you don't believe in him after you see him, I'll pay for your meal.
Brian chuckled uneasily.
Yeah, all right, whatever. I'll bite. But I'm telling you, Christmas is still days away.
Without another word, the man turned and started walking toward the door. Brian sighed, tossing a few bills on the counter. The chef didn't even look up. He had seen all this before.
Coming?
The man asked, his voice strangely calm.
Lead the way.
Brian said, pushing his way out the door into the bitter night. The icy wind bit at his face as they walked down the street, the only sound their boots crunching in the snow. The alley was only 2 blocks away, but it felt longer in the cold, with only the streetlights casting eerie shadows across the empty buildings. The man pointed toward a darkened alleyway.
He's there,
He said, a strange reverence in his voice. Brian paused at the entrance, squinting into the shadows. The alley was full of trash and discarded cardboard boxes, but there was something about it that felt wrong. A quiet sense of dread settled over him, but he shrugged it off. He was too tired to think clearly.
Well,
The man asked, his voice pressing.
you've come this far.
All right,
Brian muttered, stepping forward.
but you owe me that free dinner.
As he approached the box the man had pointed to, something felt off. The air was still and thick with an unnatural heaviness. The box looked ordinary enough, but the closer he got, the more the hairs on his neck stood up. He opened the flaps slowly. Inside was a bundle wrapped in torn cloth. It looked like a child, but something about the shape seemed wrong. He pulled the cloth aside, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The baby had eyes unlike any he'd ever seen. They were a vivid, unnatural green, glowing faintly in the dim light. Brian's breath caught in his throat. As he held the child, something cold and strange washed over him. His mind cleared, and for a fleeting moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Everything seemed to make sense.
Wait, this can't be real.
He whispered, feeling the calmness slowly dissipate. His thoughts grew confused. The man smiled, his eyes glinting.
It's real, all right?
He said softly as he stepped closer, still unblinking. Suddenly, the baby's mouth opened, revealing rows of glistening red teeth, far too many for a creature so small. Brian's heart raced as the baby lunged at his throat. He dropped it, but before he could react, the dirty man snatched it back, his smile widening into something horrific. Brian tried to scream, but his voice was drowned by the gurgling sound as blood flooded his mouth. He staggered back, his hand clutching his neck in a desperate attempt to stop the flow of blood. But it was no use. Brian vision swimming with darkness. The man simply stroked the child's head as it feasted. Brian's vision blurred and dimmed as the people from the diner appeared in the alley behind him, all of them with the same glowing green eyes.
Thank you for bringing the first.
The dirty man whispered, his voice cold as ice.
Every Christ child needs gifts.
The last thing Brian saw before he lost consciousness was the child's grotesque face split open, revealing rows and rows of sharp, red